Thanks so much. And let me just share the screen. All right. There you are. Okay. So, yeah, thank you for making the time. And especially at this time, tail end of the year, where we really are kind of saturated. So I appreciate it. So I'm talking about my new book today, which is From Pessimism to Promise, Lessons from the Global South on Designing Inclusive Tech, which came out with MIT in September. Now, basically, the what drove me to write this book was, you see, I sit on a number of different boards. I wear multiple hats. I sit on the many UN government boards, the state boards. I also work with a lot of tech companies. And so basically, and of course, I'm a digital anthropologist, so which means that I work with ground level networks and particularly in the global south. So being a digital anthropologist is just a fancy way of saying that I look at how people make meaning and integrate new technologies in their everyday lives. And I've spent about 2 decades looking at this, particularly young people in India, Brazil, Namibia, and um, mostly in marginalized contexts. So it was, immigrant communities, even in the Bronx, to refugee settlements in Brazil. So, and a lot of the informal settlements in India and Bangladesh. So with that, you would think that I should actually be even more pessimistic, right? Because it sounds like they are at the forefront of harms, they are at the forefront of deep inequality, the climate crisis. And yet, actually, what struck me was they were so much more optimistic than you and I living in, and I'm just assuming many of you are based in Europe or basically in the West. And um, that gave me pause because I realized it's a privilege to be pessimistic because you know, we have the space to be in despair. Whereas anyone who is at the ground level are looking at their future because they refuse to be in despair, which means that they have to give up on, their future. So I think there's something extremely humbling, and I felt it's really a moral imperative to hope because of people in these extraordinarily difficult situations, whether we see it in Syria to in Iran, if they can get on the streets, if they can, fight for their rights, if gig drivers in Uganda and elsewhere can really push forward for change, then surely you and I can stay optimistic enough to reform these systems. And let me tell you why this is important for us to also get on board, right? So firstly, look at what's happened in the last few years. Just you get the sense from the media is that AI is against us, right? AI potentially is going to destroy our jobs, our creativity, our social life, our mental health. And it basically can even like wipe us out as people. Academics have doubled down on the media narrative, which is like Geert Lovink, who calls himself a proclaimed pessimist and has actually declared in his, when I was actually on his book talk in a debate recently, and he said, my 25 years has been of waste. There is no alternatives. We are doomed. So that's uplifting narrative. And by the way, I really like him. I just want to let you know he's a wonderful person, but our worldviews are very different. And then you have surveillance capitalism, which says that basically capitalism is a toxic system, and basically we need to dismantle it. And the very fact that we are inhabiting these digital spaces means that we're part of a sort of capitalistic extractive regime, and we're feeding into the machine, right? You have algorithms of oppression, which really tell you how racism is baked into the design. So there's nothing you can do in a way because it's baked in, right? So it removes agency in many ways, and when it comes to, people trying to say that, well, sure, yes, we are optimistic. The way in which optimism is translated is that you're resisting AI. If you optimism is all about negating AI, and surely we can use tactics and creative insurgencies to put AI in its place, right? So and then of course Jonathan Haidt, who's actually become one of the more influential in pushing for bans. And by the way, that's part of a number of interviews I'm getting from the media, because I seem to be this lone voice saying, no, you should not ban mobile phones from, and even like completely from teenagers up to the age of 18, which is, by the way, a wave sweeping across board, right? So, you know, the Economist article just recently also asked, are American progressives making themselves sad? And basically, it did a poll which said that Americans today are far more depressed about their future, about all things digital, about their jobs and the environment. And it does not correlate with the economy, right? And the strength of the economy. It may not even correlate with their socioeconomic background. So they did it across socioeconomic demographics, age demographics, and this is really a despair situation, and they are far more pessimistic than a decade ago. On the other hand, you look at other polls coming from the global south, and you see more than 9 in 10 young people in Kenya, Mexico, China, Nigeria, and India are optimistic about their future, unlike those in, say, Germany, Britain, France, and Sweden. And, it's not just about the futures in terms of workplace, right? Again, India, Indonesia, UAE, Mexico, global south is far more optimistic than than US and Europe, right? And if you look at the climate change, same pattern. In fact, India consistently ranks, by the way, India has the largest population in the world, and it consistently ranks as the most optimistic country and over the last decade. And this is, there's a lot that's happened in India, which is we've had the demonetization, we've had increasingly sort of a stronghold government, a Hindutva government. There's so much that you would think, oh my God, what's going on? How can they be at all, optimistic? And not to forget COVID, which hit Indians, and led to one of the biggest internal migrations in India's history since its formation in 1947. So you think, what the hell is going on? This doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, how is this sort of how is this parallel going on where the West is increasingly pessimistic and the rest is increasingly optimistic? And there seems to not be a sort of convergence. Well, the typical explanations that are provided to understand these sort of seeming, contradictions and irrationalities, shall we say, is that, well, the global south are just naive. They don't understand, the implications of the climate crisis. They don't understand, they don't get it about how it's going to impact their future and how AI is harming them. But until they reach our level of literacies, so then basically it's a data deficit, a literacy deficit, right? So if only they had the data to understand this, if they only had the literacy skills to understand it, then they will be just as miserable as us. And they would, almost to the point of impotency and despair. Or the other thing is that, well, the global south hasn't reached where we have reached. We are the global north. We're right here. They're here, and it's like from the 60s. It's a linearity model, right? Is that once the global south evolves and becomes from developing countries to developed, then they will also feel as miserable as we are. Well, actually, not quite, because things have changed dramatically. Global south is no longer what it used to be from post-colonial times. In the last decades, we've had a complete transformation in many regards, in many of these contexts, to a point that a lot of the old mental models do not work in the global south. For instance, the majority of the people live in the 90% basically of the world's population lives in the global south, and they fast come online thanks to cheap mobile phones and very affordable data plans. So they are not necessarily, lagging behind. Now, let me give you five specific tropes for the purpose of, that I've, for the purpose of brevity to just sink in and how this is contradicting normative thinking today. So I'm going to go through 5 points. First is digital divide. Okay. I sit on, like I said, a number of UN boards, and one, person who's very senior, has been around for 25 years, told me, how can we in good conscience bring the global south online? Basically, aren't we feeding them into the data extraction machine? Now you have to understand, right? Coming from a UN officer where the right to the digital is inscribed in the UN Charter. I mean, so because that's become so essential as part of our everyday life that there is that kind of right? And yet, if you have that mindset, that means you're not going to provide the same kinds of access to populations because you believe it would be harmful to them while you enjoy these digital tools. And so there's a sort of double standard or almost paternalistic attitude that somehow if we are subjected to the digital spaces, we have more abilities to withstand it, and versus the global south doesn't. So we have to protect them from the digital tools, right? And you hear a lot of what I call them doomsday divas, whether they are professing the whole dismantling of the data system, the digital system, data colonialists, right? Who are saying, no, we should get out of social media. I mean, actually, even here at Loving, who's so anti-social media, is hyperactive on X. I mean, he has a significant number of followers and he is always posting, right? People, Sophia Noble was wearing, I believe, a Apple Watch on the stage when she was talking about algorithms of oppression. Or, Nick Coldry is very much active online, and he professes in a recent podcast that we have lost all control over our data, ourselves, and our lives. Now, if you really believe that, those who are professing this narrative, then you need to get off all these devices and services. And when you do not do that, then you need to pause and say, be careful what you're, championing for the others if you can't live by the same rules. Because it's not a bad thing. We do like our tools. We do like our services. The fact that I'm talking to you through this medium itself shows that we do find value in these digital tools. So why can't we give the same kind of, understanding of why people in the global south would also appreciate these digital tools and understand the risks and rewards and are making the decisions to participate in these communities just like we are. And so that's one. But the other thing is, it's not even true that they are not there yet. In fact, in my previous book, The Next Billion Users, I was documenting how young people have come online fast, and how this has transformed the way in which the internet itself is, being shaped. Because after all, we are a data-based economy, and there is power in numbers. So rather than seeing, the global south as a liability, we now have an asset, which are our people, which are our people, our data, because the data is basically their communicative practices, their affect, their feelings, their worldview, their perspectives, which are translating into audiovisual content, which AKA is data, which seems so sanitized and removed and, clinical, but it's very much visceral and very much human, right? And so that actually says something. There is power in it. And the other thing is, if you look at where the cheapest mobile internet is, it's not in Europe, it's not in the US. India, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Israel. These are places where you have the cheapest mobile internet in the world. So this needs to also make us pause, right? And it's not just we're talking about digital access. If you want to see what's the future of fintech, who are the leaders of fintech? It's East Asia, Singapore, Philippines. If you want to see the future of AVs, well, China just BYD just overtook Tesla as the biggest AV maker to a point that Elon Musk is begging Europeans to come up with regulations because he says it's going to destroy the industry. So, in a sense, it doesn't fit the narrative, right, of the global south as backward and behind the scenes. And the reason why they're so optimistic is also because they can build, I mean, thanks to the latest technologies of AI, like generative AI tools, is they can leapfrog the coding mechanisms and actually build tools which are hyper local without actually even knowing how to code. So you have numerous organizations in Africa, for instance, like Lilapa AI, that is creating small language models in their own dialects, and coming up with for African, by African sort of solutions. And this is just one of the hundreds of examples that I cover in my book. Algorithms of aspiration, here's another counter force to the dominant narrative of the algorithms of oppression is that algorithms of aspiration is really tapping into the fact that people are really, they don't just tolerate tools. These are young people who are absolutely in love with these tools despite the harms and risks. And here's why, because young people, if any of you remember what it was like to be a teenager, and I've been talking to these teens over the last 2 decades, they just want to become self actualized. And it's really difficult in the global south because you have a lot of traditions, cultures, norms. A lot of them are patriarchal societies. So if you're a young girl, if you're Muslim in India, low socioeconomic, you have a lot of parameters on how you're supposed to behave. Everyone's watching you. You're a kid anywhere in Brazil to Philippines, and there's a lot of instructions and cultural codes. So in comparison to that, you know, you basically can be a little more of yourself. You can find people like you online, which really matters. And this becomes very prescient when you are, thinking about, playing with your identity because you're trying to do self-discovery. Now, here's Neil Renaud. They are a village influencer from a tier 3 town, which is, basically at the edges of a village and urban area. And they have more followers than most fashion brands. And the way in which they become this popular is by playing with global trends. In fact, if you look at the creator economy and who's leading it, it's many of the young people in the global south who will probably never leave their village, their town, their city, their country ever. And yet they are very globally aspirational because this is the way in which they can connect with the world. And this is why they love the internet because they finally can be visible and seen, and it matters. They can also tell the stories from their terms, and so this also, what's really interesting to me is that I've been capturing these and I've been giving internal talks to Indian companies, for instance, venture capital companies, and they told me one of the things that hit them the most was the fact that they had these very preconceived notions of their own population, the rural area in India, which is, by the way, majority of Indians. They kind of wrote them off, and they've been focusing on the urban and the typical city. So it's a vicious competitive space. And they said it was very humbling because they had to rethink how they saw villages because they realized, yeah, maybe actually young people in the villages are not as stereotypical as they grew up to thinking them to be, right? And so this is also really important because we need a sort of decolonizing of our mind itself in our own context, whether we are in India and Brazil, we have a lot of preconceived notions about our own people. Forget the West and the rest, right? And that needs to be taken into serious consideration. there's also the romance economy, not to forget. The single biggest powerful factor why teenagers come online and stay online is because of sex, sexuality, and intimacy. Young people are lonely. They want to have experience and what it feels like to be loved. They want to love. And also, they want to address one fundamental question: am I a freak? Body hair, menstruation, masturbation, all these questions. It's completely plaguing your mind. Please remember how we were when we were teenagers, right? Imagine then nobody talks to you about sex and sexuality, not your family, your friends, your neighbors, not the media, not any institution. It's all taboo. Where do you learn about these things, right? And so that's why young people are getting online. And I write about a number of initiatives that have been so popular in these regions. For example, one actually in the Netherlands, driven by R&W Media, one of the oldest think tanks, NGO collectives, and they did this campaign called Love Matters, which actually got millions of hits. And basically, it's about just talking about everyday sex and sexuality things. Like, is this normal? Basically, I'm attracted to, I have this kind of sexual preference, or I can't get it up, and questions which are you can't ask people, and basically there are very few likes, but the metadata shows that millions of people are consuming this content. And so, this makes sense if you think about it, because it's really an essential part of humanizing ourselves, right? Because it's so natural to who we are. Is and not to forget, by the way, majority of global South countries criminalize the normalcy. For example, being homosexual is criminalized in majority of global South countries to a point of death in countries like Uganda. So imagine if you're a homosexual person who nobody will talk to you, and then you have a law that is that tells you that your very natural being is somehow pathological, and then you get online and you realize maybe not, right? It's fundamentally can save your life. And then are you willing to go and tell them how they are oppressed by AI and the digital, right? So do one has to see how crazy that would then sound, or try telling a woman in Afghanistan who is basically relegated to her domestic sphere because she can't walk around, can't hold a job, can't make a living, educate herself, and she find the one of her few respites being online to humanize herself and feel connected to the world and feel like a woman, and go tell her that she is part of a data extractive machine, right? So, I mean, it really is important to see the situatedness of it. Surveillance of care is another theory, is that the term surveillance has a gut level reaction that it's negative. Well, in the clinical trials, surveillance, especially for viral diseases, is actually a surveillance of care where it actually tracks people for good. And we need to always balance things about these are just systems, and they can be used for good or evil depending on what the purpose is, right? So we did a 4-year analysis. It's an IDRC project on gig economy workers, women workers in Bangladesh and India across sectors and it was overwhelmingly positive. They were so enthusiastic about the gig economy, which is so contradictory from our academic literature of digital labor precarity. Because firstly, they're like, we've always been precarious. Majority of global South economies are informal economies. So the gig economy and the gig technology did not create precarity. Precarity already existed, and what it did was enable more flexibility and more dignity in the respect of women. And that's another story, maybe in a Q&A. But what they did was they also created with digital tools a surveillance system of care to report people who they didn't like. And there's also feminist like she taxis and other kinds of operational ways in which to bring women together. But they, like, when women are going in to do housework, they share on WhatsApp group who to avoid, who not to. And in Mexico, we found same patterns, and also for their own, physical health, because it's dangerous. I mean, the gender violence is extremely high in Mexico and other kinds of Latin American contexts. So surveillance of care is extremely essential, and the digital is fundamental to that process. And women use it extensively to operate in their everyday lives. Regenerative AI versus resisting AI. And what I mean by this is that you see protests across the world by using AI generated images to make their case without putting people, actual people, in harm's way. This is just one of the AI generated images by Iranian activists to show what Iran used to be in the 70s, right? And yet these two people don't exist. In fact, they are fictional, but it makes a point, and this is basically being used by Hong Kong activists and many other. These are very fundamental to the way in which people want to communicate about protest, because it can be deadly, even a single post, right? And here is Miranda, an artist in Ecuador, who is trying to build new kinds of data sets on indigenous communities for us to rethink representation and our stereotypes about what indigenous communities are, but without losing the cultural pride of indigenous, aesthetic and culture, right? And last and but not least is data as currency. People have this a distaste for the money and monetary, as if it's and it's usually looked upon as data extraction, colonialism, fetishization. But actually, when we think about it, it's like data as currency. When I was talking to and we engaged with the refugees in many different contexts, and we were working with UNHCR very closely over a year and a half, we found that a lot of refugees are practical. It's all a matter of trade-off, right? Because it's so essential to their everyday lives and well-being that they recognize that data is a currency, and it is okay if it enables them. And we all make these contracts, when we consent to these cookies. We all make these kinds of contracts, and we're using services. So why do we put them on a different pedestal? Why do we expect them to behave in fundamentally different ways in which we behave? By the way, this is not to mitigate the need for fair governance, fair distribution, which is really in need with the big tech, right? And that's happening. I mean, governance, but surely we have other tricks in our bag besides governance, like regulation, as a way to move forward, right? Because regulation in itself is not cut it. We have to change these companies from even within, right? And so this is just one of the examples. We came up with a report with multiple reports is just one of them. And just to give you just a taste of the kinds of quotes, why they love digital media. This is one refugee saying, "My dream is to make videos because my story is hard to tell. I had 2 heart attacks and God raised me up. There are things I want the world to understand." Another is, there's a picture, there's a person who's a homosexual who actually felt finally free to be himself. A picture I took expressing that I felt very lonely. That picture made it to the top. 20 people loved it. I like that picture because it was with that picture, I understood that I have to value myself as a person. And I have so much of that kind of material. So basically, my point is that we really need to get out, burst this pessimism bubble. And I'm not saying that you don't have a right to despair. Trust me, I look at the news every morning and I'm like, why don't I just shoot myself today, right? But I also have this a recognition that I'm really lucky to be living in a liberal democracy and having a stable job. And despite the craziness, and I feel that I have a platform and a moral imperative to hope, and that's because this is very humbling for me that people across board can be also happy. By the way, they're not miserable. This is a crazy thing. I deal with so many disadvantaged communities, and they by nature happy. And one of my biggest lesson, and I'll end here, is my own sister. She has MS, multiple sclerosis, and she's one of the happiest people. And I was thinking, it's her coping mechanism. She laughs, she jokes about her illness all the time. And I'm the one who's always really dark about it. And I realize it's not very conducive. And if you start to work with disability communities, it's really an eye-opening experience of how hope and joy and humor, is so fundamental to, moving forward. And I think that's something that I take to my heart because, of course, it's within my family, but also it's in my field work. And I want to be true to that kind of ethos. And I hope others will join in. And we need, because we do need to shift that paradigm. Academia has become full of doomsday divas. We've got to change that. So, all right. Thanks